ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Before we start today's story, we're very excited to share that tickets for Conversations Live, our national tour, are selling fast. Extra shows have been added in Adelaide, Hobart and Perth. We've got a wonderful show planned for you with special guests, memorable moments and a few surprises along the way. Sarah and I would love to see you. There's a link in the show notes, or you can go to the Conversations page for more details. There's a classic Peanuts cartoon, you know, the old newspaper strip with Charlie Brown and Snoopy. And in this cartoon, the character Lucy, who's a kid with a bit of a cruel streak, she says to her little brother Linus, the boy with the security blanket, "You're not afraid of a little pain, are you?" And Linus shrieks, "Well, of course I am. Pain hurts." And Linus says it like there's a distinction between the pain and the hurt, between the signal and the nasty sensation. It sounds a bit absurd, but it turns out there's some truth to that idea. Pain has its uses, of course. It's a signal that prods you to attend to a problem or an injury in the body. But sometimes people can experience ongoing pain when no injury can be found. Professor Lorimer Moseley is here today. Lorimer is a neuroscientist at the University of South Australia who specialises in pain, what it is, why it exists, and how it can go wrong. Lorimer says that new research is now telling us so much about the strange ways in which pain works in the body. And he came to this very specific field after his own experience with chronic pain following a pretty gruesome injury on the football field. Lorimer's published hundreds of papers and several books to explain how people might be able to dig themselves out of the hellish cruelty of chronic pain. Hello, Lorimer.
G'day. How are you?
I'm well, sir.
Sir. Thanks for sir. Blimey.
It's a tip of the hat to you. Well, you're a professor, aren't you? That requires some kind of acknowledgement. First of all, Lorimer, I think we all know what pain is, but do we? I mean, what is pain to a neuroscientist? Is it well defined to people in your field?
We all know what pain is because we feel it. But to have a sort of an agreed upon definition of pain is when things get difficult because you can't feel anyone else's. So you can't sort of cross-check it. I think, you know, in our field, there are really well-accepted definitions of pain, but it's the world body that represents scientists and health professionals interested in this spent 3 days not that long ago revisiting the definition, and I think that changed one word.
Is this the subject of a conference, is it?
It was. It was the subject of a 3-day meeting, probably with some posh dinners and stuff like that.
All right, well, what's your description of pain? How would you describe it then?
Yeah, well, at risk of annoying all the other pain scientists around the place, I think about pain as a feeling that you have in your body that makes you want to stop that feeling. And you do that by protecting the body part in which you feel pain. But I think it would be a bad look for me not to mention the official definition, which is that pain is, this may not be verbatim, but pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or indicative of tissue danger. But you might be able to sense the difference between how I think about it, and that's I think about it as a feeling. And the reason that I think about it like that is that we spend a lot of time talking to people with pain on most days of their life, or people who have recovered from that situation. And that's the dominant phrasing that they use. You know, you feel it. It's a feeling in your body.
You know, you can have a cancer specialist, an oncologist who's never had cancer. You can have a heart specialist who's never had, coronary problems at all. But I think pain specialists have all experienced pain, so you've all got skin in the game, so to speak. What's the worst pain you've ever experienced, Lauren?
I've had some experiences that I look back on and think, blimey, that was painful. Dislocated shoulders and trying to do my first poo 3 weeks after an operation was horrible. It was horrible. I thought I was going to split in two.
You were so traumatised you've not been to the toilet since.
I've made sure I've kept the fibre up.
What about dental pain?
Well, I've had a fantastic dental experience myself where, I blame the McDonald's fry basket. I was having some fries and there must have been a little bit of the fry basket with the fry and it got caught up near a tooth. I got a big abscess and got to the dentist and, he said, would you like an injection? I'm just going to have a quick look down the side of the tooth. And, I considered myself somewhat of a unit. And I thought, no, that'll be fine, thanks, dentist. And then proceeded for about half an hour to have this knuckle whitening, horrible pain across my whole head until eventually I had to scream, and that's when the dentist had forgotten that they were only going to have a quick look. But they did offer me free dental treatment at that clinic for some time. Yeah, that was bad.
I shouldn't laugh. That's horrible, you poor thing. Take me through the process by which an injury will produce pain.
The process is that we have what I would describe as difference detectors all over our body, like almost everywhere in our body, with some notable exceptions. Some people might call them danger detectors. 50 years ago, we would have called them pain receptors, but we've moved on from that. The official name for these receptors that are everywhere across the body is nociceptors, and that sort of means danger detectors. I think about them as difference detectors because that's actually what they do. They detect a sudden change in the tissues of the body, and that sudden change might be in pressure or stretch or something like that, or it might be in temperature, or it might even be in the chemical balance. You know, you might have a sudden influx of acid in your tissues. You've been doing a big workout, for example. And these detectors, they simply send a message into the central nervous system. And the central nervous system refers to that part of the nervous system in your spinal cord or in your brain. And they send a message in there that effectively says something's changed. And that's all it says. But it's actually part of this extraordinary symphony of data. Like, it's gobsmacking how complex the surveillance system is in our body. And all of that data will eventually end up reaching the brain. And your brain has to then, I guess, make a snap decision on whether or not you need to do something to protect that body part. And this idea of protection is, I reckon it's a game changer for people who are experiencing pain that's not protecting them from anything anymore. And there's a lot of people in that situation. Because if we can think about the brain working hard to protect your body part, and then we can embrace the idea that the brain is extraordinarily complex and clever, and it will take into consideration a gobsmacking array of data in order to decide, well, should you protect yourself right now? Or should you not? And if it decides you're better off not protecting yourself, you just don't have pain. But if it decides you are, then the magic happens. And I don't think there's anyone alive who would be both informed and claim they know how that happens. But ultimately, a feeling comes into your awareness, and your identity in that moment becomes someone with a need to protect a body part.
You're talking about something that sounds like a very sophisticated conversation that's taking place within various parts of the central nervous system, but it's not something that's taking place with consciousness. It seems to be something that's going on in the background. I mean, we do make conscious decisions if we touch a hot stove. You know, we have this reflex and then we go, oh, I better move that, I better put that under the tap. That's part of the conscious process of dealing with pain. But the thing you've just been talking about sounds to me like something where the conscious mind doesn't really have a role to play here. There's a very sophisticated conversation happening in a split second inside the brain. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. And the first we know of pain is the pain.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you can't have pain and not know about it, right? You can have injury and you can have these reflexes like pulling your hand away from the hot stove or limping, for example. We can have all those things, but you can't have pain and not know about it, because pain is the thing that you feel. And I like to think about it, the idea of an internal protection meter that is your brain, if you like. And when we get over a certain need for protection, it's almost like the system says, in this sophisticated conversation to which you refer, Richard, it's almost like the system says, okay, we're not cutting the mustard, we're not getting rid of this problem, we need the organism to actually now do something and pay attention. And it's when you have the feeling that you want to stop the feeling. It's sort of no different from feeling cold. You know, when you feel cold, you put on another layer of clothing. But when the system has reasons to make you feel cold, even though you're not, we still take the action. Like if you've got a fever and you're shivering, your body's not actually cold, but you're getting the feeling that you're cold. And pain is like that. There's so many feelings that make you do something to keep yourself safe.
Does it work the same way with pleasure? Because I can think of all sorts of ways in which these change detectors might detect some sudden change in physical circumstances on certain parts of the body, but they produce something much, much nicer than pain in the body, if you know what I mean. Is there a point where someone goes, oh, that's going into the pleasure department rather than the pain department?
Well, there are points in which, in fact, identical information from the body, because the context is different and that individual's past experience, and I always think about values, vulnerabilities, opportunities and constraints in the moment. And we did a study when I was working in the UK that actually got pulled by the university because we were particularly looking for sadomasochists, because they can have experiences where, for example, hot thermode on their leg can evoke a feeling of pain, particularly if, it's me, the researcher, putting that thermode on their leg and saying, I'm putting it on your leg now, can you feel it? What do you think of that? And they report pain. And if we scanned their brain, we would expect to see a fairly typical pattern of someone in pain. But if you change the context and it became a mistress putting the same thermode on and possibly saying the same words but sounding different, some people will experience pleasure in that. So the same change detectors can be doing a very similar or the same thing, but the context is different. In actual fact, some of those change detectors, a class of them are called caress fibres or caress receptors. And because you get that feeling that you get with a gentle, soft caress.
Why does pain continue very often long after the initial tear or sprain or burn? After you've attended to the problem, why is that alarm bell still ringing in the head or throughout the body? Why does the body do that?
That's the question that has had us in knots for quite a long time, because this is actually a very common problem, that the sensitivity of the pain system, which ramps up immediately when you are injured. So if you have an injury or inflammation, the whole system rapidly adjusts its sensitivity, which is why when you wake up the day after an ankle sprain, if you like, and you just rest your foot on the ground, you go through the roof, right, with pain. And that's an example of the pain system sensitivity setting being rapidly adjusted. And that's actually one of the most fearful and wonderful complexities of biology, is this inbuilt ability to protect itself and change the setting. And then that's the thing that keeps the tissues, for example, of the ankle or the tear or the whatever, it keeps all danger away from that. You can't put any mechanical load through it. Any warmth hurts or specific cold hurts. And then that's what allows those tissues to heal. And normally, 9 times out of 100, the process works and the sensitivity slowly returns to normal as the tissues slowly return to normal. And then the organism or the human just keeps loading those tissues until they return to normal. But there are occasions when that sensitivity of the pain system doesn't return to normal, even though the tissues are healing and doing the right thing. And that's the problem that's led to chronic pain being humanity's most disabling health condition.
Yeah, how common is chronic pain these days? What do we know about that?
Well, the most commonly quoted stats are 1 in 5 people have pain on most days for more than 3 months, which satisfies the definition of chronic pain. And of those, probably half of them would have what we describe as high-impact chronic pain. So that's chronic pain that limits them doing the things they want to do or need to do to have the life they want. So it's very common. Broadly, 1 in 10 Australians has a reduced quality of life because of chronic pain, and the contributors to that are to some extent this enhanced sensitivity within the neuroimmune mechanisms, so the nervous system and immune system mechanisms that I call collectively the pain system. And you asked what causes it. I would say it's a mix of circumstance and previous history with what a lot of people recognise as neuroplasticity. Neurons that wire together, fire together. And the broad principle is the longer you have pain, the better your system gets at making it. So it will make it more easily, which is great if the only objective is to stop you from putting load through a body part. But actually that's counterproductive, right? It starts to become the problem. So 1 in 10 people has a system that ironically is overprotecting their body. And it feels like the body's vulnerable and he's underprotected. But that's the whole point of pain. It feels like you're breaking. As I talk about it now, I often feel this when I talk about my work, that it's so complex that that I wonder if I'll ever get my head around it.
Well, let's talk about the means by which you came into this world, this field of research, and it comes about from your own experience of a really bad injury you suffered as a young man playing soccer. Can you tell me the story of what happened?
Yeah, playing football, I remember injuring my coccyx.
How did you do that?
Well, I was playing football and I did an overhead kick, and that's when you're sort of upside down, and landed on a sprinkler, and I wasn't in the greatest of ways.
So how badly were you injured after you landed on this sprinkler?
Oh, yeah, badly enough, I guess. I broke my coccyx, and it was in a lot of bits, I think, and then I had that subsequently removed. But, I'm always self-conscious talking about this experience, Richard, because there is a tendency when anyone has chronic pain that they feel a pressure from everyone else, or from this sort of sense that everyone else is thinking, that their chronic pain needs to be justified by the size of their injury. And I think that's a really problematic thing. So
that might be true, but you said your coccyx was shattered and had to be removed. That's a very serious injury. So there's no getting around that, though, is there?
Yeah, probably not. And so I was in pain for 8 or 9 years, and for a lot of that time it was my experience and only my experience. Like the people closest to me probably didn't know, and I didn't feel confident really talking about that because I was fully functional. I was moving around, and that's often the thing with chronic pain, that it's invisible, and the general consensus out there certainly was that if you have pain for a long time, you're either sort of psychologically weak or have some sort of personality defect, or you're pretending, or it must be a horrible injury that we just can't find yet. And a lot of people will take one of those perspectives on it, whereas now 40 years of research have shown that it's seldom either of those things.
So, Lorimer, you went to uni, not initially to become a doctor, but to become a physio. Did learning more about the body and physiotherapy help you deal with your own chronic pain?
That was so interesting because I was at university, I studied physiotherapy, and I would go to the neuroscience and the biology lectures, and I still look back on them as such a special time because the neuroscience and biology was just so fascinating. And for me, as someone who was sort of living in this weird double world of having a lot of pain but being very functional and not wanting as much pain, all that biology and neuroscience was so exciting because I thought it's full of possibility for change. Like the one theme that would come through in all of the biological sciences was adaptability, change. Like every moment the system is changing and responding. And then I would go into the physiotherapy-based classes, and this is in the late 80s, so a lot of things have changed, but I would go in there and I would think, are you guys even doing the same lectures next door? Like, these two things don't seem to meet, because in the physiotherapy classes I felt like there was no hope for someone like me. But in the biosciences, it was full of hope. So I think the biosciences were pivotal in the trajectory of my life and ultimate recovery, despite the physiotherapy classes I was doing.
So that's what lured you into the world of neuroscience? You made a change?
I was hooked on neuroscience. I was hooked on neuroscience when I was at high school in Canberra, but then I guess I became a physio, and I worked as a physio initially with elite athletes at the Academy of Sport and then into a pain program. And I think the application of my love affair with neuroscience really only emerged once I was working with people with chronic pain. People would come in with these horrible stories, this nightmare of brutal pain. This is what people would turn up with. And me as a physio at that time, I felt like I just had nothing to give them. And because my understanding of the neuroscience of chronic pain was such that this was a change in sensitivity within your pain system, your nervous system and your immune system, and I would explain that to people. I would say, this is what I think is causing your chronic pain. There's nothing I can do to you to stop that or reverse that. I could give you a couple of days pain relief, but you could probably get that yourself through other activities. I was talking to people like this, and a couple of weeks later they would come back. I'd see them on my list again, and I'd be confused, and they'd say, well, I don't know what you did last time, but can we do it again, because I'm definitely feeling a bit better. And that happened time and time again, and I guess that for me really planted the seed of the power of understanding, the power of the system to use knowledge, to use understanding, to start to adapt itself towards better. And then I would say that's the real pivotal moment in my work life that triggered this pathway of going hard on understanding neuroscience, and then really just trying to get as much of that understanding across as effectively as possible.
So now we come to the really interesting part of your experience and of your work. Tell me how, when you studied neuroscience, the study of neuroscience itself, how did that change your experience of your own chronic pain?
Yeah, I mean, I reckon that was well underway when I was working part-time as a physio, but even before that, like this love affair with neuroscience, I was just reading stuff, devouring what I could at the time, and what I observed is that things just slowly got better for me, and this principle that I could sort of describe as the Goldilocks principle or the sweet zone for change, that all of the biological sciences tells us, if you can get the demand on the system right, you can trigger a little adaptation without triggering a really big protective response.
What do you mean? The body system, you mean, of pain management?
Well, at the time, I wasn't really thinking about it like that. I'd had this experience in fairly high-level sport and was around that community where the principle of adaptation to load is a core principle, right? Like if you want to get fitter, you train. If you want to get stronger, you train. The amount of training needs to be big enough to cause your system to adapt to be a bit better. But if it's too big, you'll break something. So there's this sweet zone in the middle. And the more I learned about the neuroscience of the human, I felt like I could apply that principle with more and more sophistication and success. And then over that 8 or 9 year period, I would say my own pain slowly went. And I gained insight into other experiences that I'd had that were not physically painful, but very psychologically traumatic, where the principle seemed the same. So, I just had this thirst for deeper and deeper understanding of primarily the brain, but I think the human in general.
Now, there's a story you tell about 2 experiences you've had of bushwalking. Can you take me through what happened, first of all, on that first time when you were bushwalking and you happened, as one does, to be wearing a sarong while you were bushwalking?
Yeah, so I was walking in the bush with a sarong on. Favourite time of the day, early morning. And I only mention the sarong just because that's a daft thing to be wearing barefoot in a sarong in the bush. But the moment that I remember was scratching my leg on something. And the experience was I felt like a scratch from a twig or something. I remember kicking that off and then proceeding to the river and taking off my sarong and having a swim and getting out. And then that's about the last thing that I remember until I sort of woke up, I think, a few days later, to then find out I'd been actually bitten by an eastern brown snake during that episode. And the reason the context comes into it is that I had almost no pain.
So, sorry, an eastern brown snake bit you on the leg, planted its fangs into your leg, injected you with its venom, and you went, oh, that's a scratch from a twig.
But I never saw the snake that bit me. And you're right, yeah, its fangs, apparently it was a significant bite, and its poison does a couple of things to you. So those danger or those difference detectors that I was talking about earlier, they would have been going berserk, right? Absolutely berserk. But my brain, this is how I make sense of the situation, my brain had been in that situation so many times growing up where I was not in danger. So when we got to this decision, like this flood of data come into my brain, and my brain says, so do you need protecting here? And concludes, no, I don't think so. We've been there before, and it was in the bush, you're walking barefoot. I used to do that all the time, get scratches on my legs. And so the system did not make pain when pain would have possibly been the best thing. I mean, that's also nuanced, right? Like maybe if I had pain, I would have panicked and the blood would have gone everywhere and I would have died. So maybe it's like a double jeopardy. Maybe my brain double thought. Who knows? We'll just never know. But the contrast with a subsequent experience is the thing that blows my mind.
Well, what happened on this subsequent experience?
Well, the subsequent experience, I was walking in the bush, again, similar sort of setting. I was wearing shorts and I think I was wearing shoes, very wise. Mid-gait, similar sort of movement context, certainly visual and sounds and all that sort of stuff. And I scratched myself. I felt this pain in my leg, and then that pain became horrible, stinging pain shooting up my leg. And, when I think about that, the difference detectors were activated. They sent a message into my brain, and my brain sort of quickly asked this question, where are you? What are you doing? Have you been here before? Is this worth protecting? And the answer to that question was, you are going to die. So I'm going to do everything I can to stop you in your tracks. And it did. Like I remember being thrown off the track with this terrifying pain in my leg, and I was looking for the snake. The whole walking party stopped, and then eventually I looked at my leg, and there's this very neat little scratch from a twig, which only 9 months earlier I wouldn't have noticed. But this time, because of one more episode, my system absolutely produced this pain, which I said before, this feeling in my leg that made me think about nothing else other than protection.
So what's the lesson you want to draw from those two separate episodes of bushwalking?
The lessons I draw out of that range from fairly broad celebratory lessons of, aren't we astonishing? Like, aren't we an astonishing, fearfully, wonderfully complex, unified organism that can consider every single thing we've got stored, all the data around us, to produce an output as terrifying and effective as pain? So that's the broad thing. From a more specific approach to it, we spent a lot of time identifying from recovered patients why they think they've recovered. And a key theme that comes out of that is people saying, I learnt that many factors influence my pain, not just my body. And I think that snakebite story captures the absolute reality that the brain will consider many, many factors when it comes to pain, when it's deciding how much danger you're in. And that actually, from my work perspective, trying to untangle chronic pain and reduce the burden of chronic pain, that opens up a whole lot of hope.
Before you were telling us those two stories of bushwalking experiences that you had, Lorimer, first time you felt what you thought was a little scratch on your leg while walking through the bush turned out to be an eastern brown snake bite that hospitalised you. Second experience, you felt a scratch, which was a scratch from a twig, and you yelped in pain and felt like you were going to die momentarily. This comes down to one of the key points of your research, which is the difference between the perception and the sensation of pain. This is where we get to the really weird idea of perception then, doesn't it? When you talk about the perception of pain, do you mean the kind of field of awareness we carry around with us?
Yeah, I do. These words are highly problematic in our field, actually. There are people who describe pain as a sensation. There are people who describe it as a perception. And there are fields, for example, psychology, that describe those two things in one way, and other fields, for example, physiology, that would flip the definitions.
All those things can be true, though, can't they? All of them can be true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so unclear on what someone will hear when I say sensation or perception that I don't even use those words. So I just describe it as a feeling. But in the spirit of your question, there is so much happening in the back end behind the feeling of pain. There are a whole lot of neural signals, immune molecules, blood flow change, all these things that happen that are broadly part of the picture. But I reserve pain for the feeling bit. And when we're trying to change pain, we really have to consider the back end. And that's where, as a physiologist, I would say the sensations around pain, and the sensation is the detection of an event in your tissues and the transmission of that event through neurons into your spinal cord, up your spinal cord, triggering processes in your thalamus and the rest of your brain. And I would say that's the sensory component.
When you're talking about the feeling, are you talking about the emotional distress then produced by pain?
No, I'm not. When I say the feeling, I think you can have the feeling of pain, but you might also have the feeling of distress. You might be suffering. You might have the feeling of fear of the pain, for example. But when we think about pain, we think about it as the end result of a whole lot of other stuff. So I guess a way of making this point is that we now know that pain and fear feel like they go together. If we did an experiment, and these experiments have been done, where we manipulate some experimental stimulus, we now know that fear trumps pain, so that if you're in a situation where your existence is under threat and you're about to lose a limb because of injury, you will experience feelings that go with protecting your livelihood, not protecting that body part. And we can access examples of this with stories from the battlefront and severe injuries that are not painful until your life is secure. And then the injuries become very, very painful.
There's a famous study that was done during the Second World War, I think it was the Marshall study, whereby some patients were interviewed by a psychologist. These were patients in a military field hospital who'd all been injured in battle. And the psychologist found something fascinating. He said that as he interviewed them, some of these men had been quite seriously injured, but they were going to be okay. They were going to recover. And he said, how's your pain? And they'd quite often say, oh, it's not too bad. You should talk to the fella in the next bed. And he thought about this, and his opinion was that for these young men, the war was over for them. They'd been injured, but they knew they were going to live. They hadn't let down their comrades. They were probably going to go home as heroes, but primarily they knew they were going to live. Consequently, pain that they might have felt was lessened because of that the kind of sense of psychological well-being you're talking about there. Do you see that? Is that connected to the kind of thing you're talking about here?
Yeah, 100%. And this is an example of how thinking about pain as something the brain does to achieve an objective makes those sort of situations more accessible, right? If we think about pain being something the body sends to be detected, then it's a lot harder to get your head around why someone would have they're missing a limb in that military field hospital and they're pain-free. And in actual fact, Silas Weir Mitchell, who wrote a lot in the American Civil Wars, I think, he has all these accounts of people missing limbs, pain-free, but when they would inject them for some reason, they would scream blue murder on the injection. One of my university neuroscience professors said as we were leaving a lecture, the worst injuries are often the least painful. And at the time, that made no sense to me whatsoever. And I called him on it. I said, that's bollocks. And he said, you go down to the Royal North Shore Hospital and have a look, which is what I did. And I remember, and I set up this data collection form, with the goriness of the injury and the writhe index and all these other things I'd made up. And this guy walked in to A&E with a hammer stuck in his neck. Right, the curly bit of the hammer had gone in the back of his neck and was coming out the front. There was blood everywhere, and he was holding it up. And he had no neck pain. I asked him. I said, "Does that hurt?" And he said, "No, it doesn't hurt. It hurt a bit when it went in, hit something hard." And I was thinking, "Yeah, that's a vertebra. Like, oh, how bad?" Anyway, he had no neck pain. He proceeded to tell a great joke to everyone, reenacting being a hammerhead shark with a hammer in his neck, sort of upright, and said, "I'm a hammerhead shark." And then he hit his knee on a coffee table and he was jumping up and down swearing. And I thought, wow, what is going on? Yeah.
So you did a study on perception and pain that involves a switch. Can you explain how this experiment worked, please?
So that was a great experiment done by Abby Tabor, who was a PhD student now in the UK. We were interested in whether this survival drive affects your perception of things that we think are really standard, like how far away is something. So she set up an ingenious experiment where there was a switch on the table in front of you, and you first had to estimate the distance in centimetres to the switch. And then in another condition, the switch became a switch that would turn off a painful stimulus on your other hand. And as soon as we manipulated the meaning of the switch to be a pain-relieving switch, the average estimate of distance reduced. So people perceived the switch to be closer to them when it had the potential to alleviate their suffering, if you like. And the reason that this is, I think, an important study is that it shows that your brain is also calculating benefit. It's called economy of action hypothesis broadly, but calculating and producing perceptions that will facilitate your well-being. And now, not many people are going to go into a lab and have this experiment, but many people with, for example, painful knees will face a set of stairs. And some of Abby's other work in her PhD showed that if you've got painful knee arthritis and you look at a set of stairs, you judge there to be more stairs than if you don't have painful knee arthritis. And you also might judge a hill to be steeper if you're wearing a backpack than if you're not. So all these distortions of your physical surroundings are all consistent with the brain quickly making calculations. I mean, how cool is that, really?
That's astonishing. Sometimes it's a bit like the way you're describing the way our pain systems work, if that's what you'd call it. It's a bit like, you present with a problem and then a whole lot of doctors have a conference away from you in private and they go, well, we think this might actually be quite serious. We better tell the patient now. Hello, you best move your hand away from the stove. Is it like that?
Yeah, almost. That's a nice metaphor. I mean, we also have in place with the stove idea, we have in place reflexes that we have no control over. That if there is a very large and sudden increase in, for example, temperature, that will trigger very quickly a direct reflex to muscles in that limb to pull it away before your brain even learns that it's happening.
Before you even feel the pain too.
Yeah, we don't know how often this happens, but this probably happens without you ever feeling pain because the reflex has solved the problem. So what's the point of having pain if you haven't burnt yourself? And modern thought around this, which is, gets one step harder to get your head around, is that we currently think that all of this is being done in advance, so that you're actually predicting the very next moment all the time. And it's only when you get information from your body or elsewhere to tell you your prediction was wrong that you change something. That's a bit out there. But actually for pain, it's a really interesting idea and puts into new understanding a lot of the remaining mysteries around pain.
We've been talking about what happens when the pain system acts like an overprotective, half-crazed nanny that's trying to protect us long after the tissue's healed, long after there's any real danger to our system. What about when it goes the other way, when there is a problem and the pain system isn't going off? For example, quite often people will receive a cancer diagnosis almost accidentally without ever feeling that anything is wrong in their bodies at all. What's happening there?
Yeah, that's great. So these difference detectors that we might call danger detectors, and once upon a time we called pain receptors, these difference detectors respond to a speed of change within the tissues. So if the rate of change is very low, they are never triggered and they don't ever send a message to the brain saying something's changed. And the most obvious and I guess dangerous example of that is cancer. When cancer is slow growing, though it's not detected until all of a sudden a blood vessel is occluded and there's a sudden drop in oxygen, for example, then you might have a symptom. And in fact, the pain system really only fails under, there's three conditions under which it fails. One is things are too slow, like you've described. That also happens with burn. Sunburn's an example. That the increase in temperature in your skin is too slow for it to hurt at the time, but you sit there for hours and you can have serious burns in your skin. So the pain system failed in that way. Another of the three mechanisms is that it happens too quickly, and that's when we sustain an injury because of some sort of an event. We fall over or pick up a box that's heavier than we imagined or something like that. And then the third way is that the brain or the organism evaluates that something else is more important. For example, you might sustain quite a severe injury, but you're not sure that your children are safe. And your brain concentrates on making sure your loved ones are safe, after a car accident or something like that. Or you've got a very important job at work and you get the job done and then all of a sudden you hand in that case or that assignment at uni or something like that, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of pain. But they're the only three mechanisms by which the pain system seems to fail. The problem is that we might all have those scenarios over life. We probably do. So we all sustain injuries and some people get cancers that grow until there's quite a big problem but with no symptoms. Or a significant cause of infertility is endometriosis tissue that's not associated with any symptoms at all. And one reason for that may be that it grows slowly.
I recently did an interview with Ben McIntyre, the British author, about the storming by the SAS of the Iranian embassy in London in 1980. And when the button was pushed and all the SAS soldiers had the go signal, one of them was abseiling down the side of the building and a grenade went off inside that set fire to the curtains. And this poor guy's line got hitched and his legs were sort of slowly being roasted by the fire. And it was some time before he could be cut loose. But he was cut loose. He got to his feet and just continued with his task, not apparently feeling any pain, went to rescue the hostages, did all of that. And when all it was done, he was like, ow, my leg. How well understood is that as a phenomenon?
I mean, that's a perfect example, isn't it, of the organism having more important matters to deal with.
What's going on in the system then? With these change detectors, these difference detectors, they've not gone off, or they are, but they've met a hitch along the way before they've got to the central nervous system?
Yeah, I would say that they've definitely gone off. They've definitely gone off. They've definitely triggered messages, a flood of messages into the brain. I mean, not unlike my snake bite, but in a way, way more. Burning, a barrage of messages would have reached the brain saying something has seriously changed across your legs, right? But this is where the brain's power comes in, that the brain has an objective. There's an agenda for that organism. So that SAS person, the agenda is to get a job done, and it's sufficiently important for that person at that moment in time that despite all of this information coming from his body saying this is a serious problem, his brain does not make pain. It's extraordinary when you think about it.
I want to go back now to chronic pain that exists for no apparent reason, when there's no sign of any damaged tissue, when the patient is otherwise healthy, they go for scans, the scans reveal nothing, there's really ostensibly nothing wrong, and yet the patient feels chronic pain. How frustrating is it for patients to be going through that?
Oh, it's horrible. There will be people who listen to this who are in that situation, and the first point to make really clear is this is legit horrible pain. Feels exactly like you're being broken in two. However, it's highly stigmatised out there. Chronic pain is about where depression was 20, 25 years ago, because it's hard to get your head around. But frustration's probably not the worst of it, I think. The feeling of being not believed when you're in pain because the scan is clear or doesn't explain your whole situation. The medical system and the health system tends to historically conclude, well, there's nothing wrong in there, so what's wrong with you? So people feel blamed, they feel abandoned, and all the while they're in a lot of pain.
So what have you found? Have you found that your own experience of, as you learnt as a student of neuroscience, how pain works in the body, how that system of pain works in the body, as you found that your own experience of chronic pain receded, have you found this can work for other people who are suffering this kind of chronic pain?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I'd probably want to make clear that I spoke about working in a pain clinic, and these people started to come back saying, I don't know what you did last time, but can we do it again? And it was all about giving them an understanding. But I am a firm believer, like I'm a card-carrying scientist, right? And there are real problems with someone like me who's got a lived experience of recovery, presuming that everyone else should just do what I did. I don't believe that. So clinical trials are the way to test the ideas, randomised clinical trials. There are now 85 randomised controlled trials of educating people about how pain works as a treatment for chronic pain. And clinical guidelines, which are the documents that health professionals and medical professionals should use to guide how they treat people, clinical guidelines wherever they exist now stipulate that education should be first line, so the first and most important thing we do. We've now got enough data from chronic back pain to allow people. There was a group at Sydney University who did this thing called a network meta-analysis, which is a fancy way of comparing all the treatments that have been tested in clinical trials to each other. They did this for chronic back pain that concluded that education programs provide the most sustainable benefits for people with chronic back pain. So there's all this evidence now, 25 years later, to say that if we can impart an understanding of how pain works to people who have chronic pain, the opportunity for improvement is increased a lot, and many recover completely. And this is almost inconceivable when you're in chronic pain, because you think, that can't be true. How could learning something change the damage in my body? And yet the thing that we're really keen to help people understand is that when the pain system becomes overly sensitive, it overestimates the vulnerability of your body. And learning about that seems to be the critical step in then learning skills of how to retrain this oversensitive pain system. And this is the game changer in the last sort of 10 years, I think, of pain research. There is enough data now to show that understanding how pain works is a key, almost missing link from the last 30 or 40 years of practice, where we've known some good things to do, broad principles of slowly becoming more active, learning better sleep hygiene, these sorts of things. There's lots of different ways to self-manage. But actually the critical facilitator of that seems to be gaining an understanding of how pain works that aligns with our current scientific understanding. The challenge for people like me is it's very difficult to teach that stuff.
So you want to help patients recalibrate their pain mechanisms to train their mind to accept what a useful measure of pain, but no more than that, in other words.
I'd probably go a little bit more mechanistic than that. We are now working hard to identify the best ways of equipping patients or people with chronic pain who have disengaged with healthcare, because they often do, equipping them with a principle and then the skills with which to apply that principle to slowly retrain their pain system or their nervous system over time to be less sensitive. And that might sound nuanced and maybe even semantically different from what you propose, but we know that if you've got chronic pain, you don't want anyone telling you anything that might make you think it's not real. Like, there's this thing that happens when you miscommunicate the glorious, fearful and wonderful complexity and possibility of modern neuroscience of pain. If you miscommunicate that, you're guaranteed you're going to get the fuck off posture. I've just heard you say, this is all in your head. It's not real. And that is such a problematic message, because someone in chronic pain knows it's 100% real, you bastard, that sort of stuff. So we really try and think about this from the same perspective that we might think about a golfer with the yips, a cricketer who needs to get better off the back foot, a violinist who's having trouble with a certain piece. This is a retraining your nervous system gradually over time with consistent training that's difficult to do, but can be done. But until you understand why that's a good way to go, the evidence tells us you're not going to do it, which is fair enough. And understanding is not enough. You have to have understanding and then a set of skills to start to retrain your system. So we really like to move away from any sense of blame or not real or psychological defects, those sorts of things, because they're rife in the chronic pain world and they're highly problematic and they're not accurate at all.
Accepting the reality of the existence of chronic pain, even if there's no ostensible tissue damage, might it also be associated with other stresses or traumas that are going on in that patient's life?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about many factors can influence pain, if one can get one's head around the idea of pain protecting our body, protecting us, then we can start to ask the question, in your whole life, what cues is your system getting that tells you you're in danger? So if you're under stress, that's a clear cue. And we now understand that certain environments can give cues, certain relationships, certain activities, certain information, some people in your life, all of those things. Those cues can also be balanced or offset by safety cues. And we talk about DIMS, which is the acronym DIM, stands for danger in me, and SIMS, the acronym is safety in me. And we talk about the balance between DIMS and SIMS, and DIMS and SIMS can hide in hard-to-spot places. We encourage people to look beyond the body part that hurts to find these DIMS and SIMS, and we can identify things all across our lives. Like we're spending a lot of time in rural South Australia and Victoria at the moment, but it makes total sense that when the rains don't come, the back pain gets worse. When the rains come too hard and the topsoil gets washed off, the pain gets worse. When interest rates go up, the pain gets worse. When relationships break down, the pain gets worse. When your kid's getting bullied at school, the pain gets worse. As well as all the other things that might be a little bit more conventionally intuitive, like if you overdo it on your knee, the pain gets worse. And we think about those things in exactly the same way. And this approach to mental health is intuitive and sensible. This approach to pain in your body is not immediately intuitive, which is why we've realised over the last 20 years, the first step for us, aside from recognising all pain is real, is totally personal experience and is a legitimate biologically based health condition responsible for more disability than any other health condition. That's our first step. Our next step is to recognise it's complex, it's multifactorial, and the system changes over time. The pain system changes over time. So stressors, absolutely. And ask anyone with chronic pain. When they get more stress, their pain gets worse.
As you've been talking, the thought has kind of occurred to me that the whole body of human literature that's been written over the millennia, you could kind of call it a history of human pain, really. Is pain really right at the centre of the human story?
That's a really profound question and taps into one of my apprehensions about being invited onto your show, Richard. Which is everyone I've heard you interview just feels so much more interesting than me and could speak with authority on those sort of questions. I can't, but what I can say is I've always been very interested in humans, and I do think that pain is one of those personal, deep in your gut sort of experiences that you have as a human, and I wonder if that's part of the reason I still find it fascinating. But you're right. I mean, pain has made it into writings forever. Pain makes it into this wide, diverse range of areas, right? We use pain as the metaphor when we don't have a word to capture how bad something is. Interest rate pain, economic pain, the pain of unrequited love. These things, for my mind, are metaphors. Like pain is something you feel in your body. But if your anguish is bad enough and you're wanting to get that across, you say, this is the pain of grief, for example.
Just one final question. Are you wearing the long pants on your bushwalks these days, Lorimer?
No, I'm not. And
You've learnt nothing, have you? You've learnt nothing.
Very intentionally. No, very intentionally. I mean, that's a very, very good question, Richard, because it's a metaphor for the challenging things that everyone faces when they've had a traumatic experience. How much do you give in?
Right. This is your exposure therapy, is it?
It is.
That's very impressive. It's been amazing speaking with you, Lorimer, and thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Professor Lorimer Moseley is a neuroscientist, pain specialist, working at the University of South Australia. Today's conversation with Lorimer Moseley was made on the lands of the Gadigal people. The producer was Maggie Morris. The executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.